Good afternoon, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Paul Kiritsis. Today I'll be giving some reviews on some books that I have read, books, articles and so forth that comprise a bibliographical diary I've been working on. And the full bibliographical details will be supplied on my website sometime very soon. The first one I want to talk about is by Koku van Stukred. The translation is by Nicholas Goodrick Clark, Professor Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who also happens to be my supervisor, my teacher. It's called Western Esotericism, A Brief History of Secret Knowledge. It's a very small book, it's not very big. It's pretty much an indispensable summa of the history of Western Esotericism, detailing the contributions made by its key figures. The book is unencumbered by technical jargon, and thus accessible to both the scholar and the dilettante. It should be bought and read for its introduction alone, a section which sheds light on the development of esotericism as a scholarly field, its primary characteristics, as well as an introduction to key historiographical issues. Koku van Stukred gives a well-balanced historiographical account of esotericism throughout, beginning from its very roots in the melting pot of Alexandria in late antiquity and exploring the kernel of its ideas in a linear fashion, its Judaic influences, the rebirth and evolution of its perspectives during the Renaissance, its often unacknowledged contributions to what would become contemporary science, the brotherhoods that institutionalized esoteric knowledge, the Eastern exoteric appeal of Helena Blavatsky's Theosophical Society, and finally the reception of ahistorical approaches during the 20th century and the quixotic notions of the New Age. Stukred has included an extensive bibliography for a more systematic investigation of each area of inquiry. This book, I think, should be on the shelves of all esoteric libraries. It's really good. The next one which I would like to talk about is the Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetica, the Greek Corpus Hermeticum and the Latin Asclepius in a New English translation, with notes and introduction, translated and edited by Brian Copenhaver, and the publication, the date of publication is 1992, and it was reprinted again in 2000. You can find it easily on Amazon.com. I don't have a copy to show you, but in regards to this specific translation, I had a few things to say. Brian Copenhaver's translation no doubt ranks as one of the best of the Greek Corpus Hermeticum and the Latin Asclepius on the grounds that he includes substantial notes, almost twice as long as that of the actual text. And he explicates particular parts of the translation. He also gives a brief historiographical and hermeneutical analysis of its 17 tractates in the introduction, as well as noteworthy translations that precede this one. Those of Walter Scott, Garth Fowden, Andre Juan Festugier, and others. In my mind, I think the first of these tractates, entitled Poimander, the Unity of Knowledge of the World, the Self and God, is one of the philosophical corpus's most important frame narratives because it implicates the theological core of the Hermetic cosmology and anthropology. Presented in the form of a dialogue between Hermes and his son Tat, it is revealed to the reader that the cosmos and man were fabricated from the polarity of spirit and matter by the transcendent God, who didn't enact the endeavor himself, but through the mediation of two projections, Nous and an androgynous proto-human. Of course, this suggests that man of course meaning humanity, is something of a brother or sibling to God and holds an entirely dignified and exalted place in the cosmos. His most important task, according to Hermes, is to remember this and to work towards it. A beautiful myth that mirrors the Gnostic myth of Sophia illustrates the entombment in matter. Alchemy shares these Hermetic and Gnostic perspectives. The book could have been the greatest, I think, of translations of the Corpus Hermeticum had the Greek and Latin versions of the Corpus Hermeticum and Asclepius been included. The next one that I want to talk about is this one here, the Hermetic Tradition by Julius Evola, subtitled Symbols and Teachings of the Royal Art, published in 1995, I believe. This one's a slightly thicker book than the other one. Julius Evola no doubt takes esoteric alchemy to another level. In this book, he implicates Hermeticism and alchemy to be one and the same, a cosmological teaching that transcends time and space and does not lend itself to contemporary scientific or historical scrutiny. In this way, he is adhering to a cosmology based on loyalty and faith. The book is a 20th century attempt to reinvent an age-old esoteric view of the real world as a pre-modern realm of alteration identical in nature, the human personality and the cosmic spirit, using motifs and imagery from Gnostic myth, Neoplatonism, mysticism, and other philosophical traditions to illustrate these changes. It is divided into two sections. The first is the symbols and teachings, and the second is the Hermetic Royal Art. The first is an exposition on the alchemical symbols, which, according to Evola, are existential ciphers and form the language of this cosmological system. He illuminates mythological and Hermetic context as a pivotal factor as to how these multidimensional symbols should be read and interpreted. The second describes and juxtaposes technical aspects of the alchemical process with the liberation of one's consciousness from psychic impurities, like emotions and drives for the sake of illumination. Given his theosophical bent, many of the processes he described were reminiscent of the disengagement of consciousness from body, otherwise known as astral projection, to New Age thinkers. The chapters are quite condensed and require at least two to three readings, so you can digest them properly. The next article, which I'm going to review, is written by Albert de Jong, and it's called Zosimus of Panopolis, and it's in the Bible of people involved in Western Esotericism, or it should be the Bible anyway. It's called The Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. It's a very, very thick book, so as it contains a ridiculous amount of entries, almost on every topic in esotericism one can think of. It's good to invest in it. It's about 130 or 40 bucks. I can't remember how much, but you can get it off Amazon.com, and you can get secondhand copies off there as well if you can't afford to give that much money. So in this article, Zosimus of Panopolis, Albert de Jong reveals that this alchemist, Zosimus of Panopolis, was a Hellenized Egyptian of Panopolis in Upper Egypt, and is the first historically verifiable alchemist to have pursued alchemy in its dual guise of mystical and practical art. Given that the absence of contemporaneous literature, Jung resorts to an analysis of cultural, religious, as well as operative temples and places around during Zosimus's time for the approximate dating of his lifespan, which most people put between 250 and 350 CE. There is also an allusion to one of Zosimus's many practical texts, the Letter Omega, to illuminate his emphasis on spiritual receptivity, along with his condemnation of theurgical and astrological practice where it relates to the alchemical opus. So Zosimus was actually quite against astrological and theurgical practice. Moreover, Zosimus's knowledge of the dual nature of the first man, Thoth Adam, reveals an acquaintance with Poimander, the first tractate of the Corpus Hermeticum, so he was obviously quite familiar with those texts. The author also reasons against any Jungian interpretation of Zosimus's alchemical texts. And with relation to the Corpus Hermeticum, it's only natural that Zosimus would have known of it, given that he was himself a Gnostic. The next article, which I'm going to review, is also from the same book, Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. It's an article written by Richard Caron in that particular book, and it's called Fulcanelli. Richard Caron's succinct article puts together some very viable possibilities regarding the real identity of quasi-master Parisian alchemist Fulcanelli, the alleged author of 2 20th century alchemical texts that suggest that the secret to successfully creating the Philosopher's Stone is cleverly encoded into the French cathedrals. The preface to both were written by Fulcanelli's alleged disciple, Eugene Cancellier, and illustrated by Jean-Julien Champollion. The latter is explicitly identified as Fulcanelli himself. According to Caron, a 1987 book that was written by André van der Broek on esotericist René Schwaller de Lubeck revealed that the just mentioned Anne Champagne met regularly and discussed apocryphal alchemical documents and the great work in confidence that it would all remain confidential. When the treatises on the cathedrals were finally published, they contained ideas that had originated with de Lubeck. De Lubeck was convinced that the publications were masterminded and executed by Champagne, an assertion that is supported by written documentation in the form of a letter from Cancellier to de Lubeck. Whilst Caron's deductions are probably right, it is remiss of him not to mention Frater Albertus, whose own work was influenced by the publication of Fulcanelli's 2 apocryphal works. The next source that I would like to talk about is a book titled Alchemy, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. It's by Titus Burckhardt, and it's this book here. Published in 1986, first publication. As I said, I'll put up bibliographical references to all of these up on the website soon. In this particular text, Titus Burckhardt proceeds along the path hewn out by Julius Evola in the Hermetic Tradition, Symbols and Teachings of the Royal Art, in presenting alchemy as a cosmological and metaphysical system replete with symbols that chart the birth and evolution of spirit within the soul of each individual. He insinuates that the becoming of spirit mirrors the macrocosm through correspondence and illuminates a nexus of deeper meanings by forging analogies in metallurgical and chemical processes. Burckhardt gives a short exposition on the art's Western origins and goes on to anatomically dissect its main features. The formative forces represented by the planets and the metals, elemental rotation, the principles of sulfur, mercury, and salt, as well as the chemical marriage, all of which govern this philosophical schema. There is also an esoteric interpretation of the Emerald Tablet. Burckhardt's prose is a delight, I would say, and make comprehensible a sevenfold manifestation of the divine spirit, whose inherent nature is heated by the polar opposites of the sun, or gold, and on the other side, the moon, or silver. Chapters 5 and 15 are especially important, for they bring to light the connection between the physical configuration of the planetary symbols and their meanings, as well as how they link in and affect the 3 primary stages of the alchemical opus, which are nigredo, albedo, and rubedo. The next source which we have, which I'd like to talk about, is this book here. It's called The Inner West, An Introduction to the Hidden Wisdom of the West. It's edited by J. Kinney, published in 2004. It's a really, really great collection of essays. It was one of the first books on Western Esotericism that I bought. It's basically J. Kinney's attempt to put together an introductory anthology to the Western Esoteric traditions for the untutored individual, or those whose knowledge in the area is minimal. In his introduction, he defines the term Inner West, gives a short discourse on the book's main sections, and provides references for those wishing to delve deeper into the presented topics. The first section of the book looks at the 3 main tributaries that form the esoteric current, namely Hermeticism and Alchemy, Neoplatonism and Gnosticism, The second examines the three main monotheistic traditions in their esoteric guise. The third discusses the manifestation of esotericism as alchemy, magic, astrology, tarot, the divine feminine, as well as neo-pagan movements. The fourth looks at the main torchbearers of the Western esotericism, namely the Knights Templars, the Rosicrucians, and the Freemasons. And the last of these, the fifth, explores the lives and teachings of some great mystics and visionaries in Emanuel Swedenborg, Helena Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, René Schwoller-de-Luwitz, George Gurdjieff, and René Guénon. All the essays gathered into this anthology are well researched and written, providing up-to-date scholarly and multifarious views of the selected topics, whilst resisting any temptation to draw definitive conclusions. In the end, the final word is rightfully and faithfully left to the devices of each reader. I would have liked to have seen also an essay on Carl Jung, as he is fundamental to 20th century esotericism. Really good book. Highly recommended. The next book which I would like to speak about is a very similar text. This one's by Richard Zmoli and J. Kinney. So it's called Hidden Wisdom, A Guide to the Western Inner Traditions. That's how thick it is. Quite a big book as well. Published in 2006. In this book, Richard Zmoli and J. Kinney have contributed what might be described as an adequate introductory volume to the rapidly growing field of introductory texts to Western esotericism. In the introduction, they implicate the internal salvific, intuitive and transcendental process known as Gnosis that typified the Gnostic religion of late antiquity as a primary feature of Western esotericism, and give an etymological perspective on the latter. The first chapter is dedicated to the contributions of Carl Jung, and rightfully so, seeing as he's the most important interpreter of the Western esoteric tradition in the 20th century. However, the book does carry a Jungian bias. Chapter 2 to 12 busy themselves with the same denominations of inquiry as those in the Inner West, barring two sections on shamanism and the New Age movement. Zmoli and Kinney are objective, insightful, and conscientious in their writing, providing a list of references at the end of each chapter for further study and linking the chapters in a format conducive to intellectual and philosophical understanding as well as historical context. The first chapter on the psychiatrist Jung, for instance, is followed by the Gnostics, who might be called the first psychologists. Chapter 3 then expounds on how the Gnostic ideas facilitated an inner approach to Christianity, the latter assimilating aspects of the Kabbalah during the Renaissance. Incidentally, the Kabbalah happens to be the subject matter of the following chapter. The Kabbalah is most fittingly followed by magic, a practice underpinned by the theory of the former. There was overemphasis on Aleister Crowley in the chapter on magic. In my mind, there is a definitive question mark over his motives and character, so I'm probably not the biggest fan of Aleister Crowley. In the next one is this one here that I want to talk about. It's called The Golden Thread, The Ageless Wisdom of the Western Mystery Traditions, and it's by Jocelyn Godwin. So this one's not a very big book either, so they're all quite abbreviated introductions, apart from this one. In this one, in The Golden Thread, it's a short book which examines the Western esoteric traditions from the Renaissance to the present, returning to the ancient past only to examine the foremost minds whom have contributed to its philosophical and metaphysical perspectives. So for example, Plato, Pythagoras, the mythical Orpheus, and so forth. A significant addition otherwise absent from other introductory texts is the notion of the collective thought forms known as egregores, to which an entire chapter is devoted, which I found very interesting. That's actually quite a very interesting chapter. The book also places vital importance on the facet of active imagination as a tool for metaphysical inquiry, aligning itself with the analytical psychology of Carl Jung. Jocelyn Godwin is entirely selective and biased in the presentation of his material, giving preference to Hermeticism, Alchemy, Neoplatonism, and the Gnostic religion, and totally ignoring the contribution of other streams like the Kabbalah and Sufism. Godwin is not an impartial writer, taking refuge for many of his opinions beneath the cover of academic discourse and rhetoric that jettisons affiliation with possessive pronouns. There's a very memorable one in Chapter 8 on the negative theology, in which polytheism is decreed superior to monotheism on the basis of its pluralism and universalism. According to Godwin, Semitic monotheism was a retrograde step in almost every respect, and that's on page 70. Good introductory text it is, when accompanied with, say, Hidden Wisdom, a guide to the Western inner tradition. So these two together would be good. Gives a good overview of the Western esoteric traditions. The next piece which I would like to talk about is called Carl Gustav Jung. It's written by Christine Maillard. It's an article in Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. So Christine's article in the dictionary gives a well-balanced, coherent and favourable review of Carl Jung's life and contributions to Western esotericism. Proceeding in a chronological fashion, Maillard identifies the metaphysical and occult convictions of Jung's unique interdisciplinary approach and their critical importance in a systemic formulation of an analytical psychology comprised of interlacing psychic elements, so the collective unconscious, the archetype, synchronicity, and the lifelong process of self-actualization or individuation. Maslow called it self-actualization. For Jung, it was individuation. Maillard illuminates how Jung's ontological approach to achieving totality of being satisfies criteria conducive to a scholastic induction into the esoteric body, whilst concurrently detailing his subsequent attempts to define certain esoteric currents and manuscripts in light of these newly formed psychological concepts. The author's exposition of Jung's cultural interpretation of alchemy and astrology is quite favourable, but she fails to bring to the reader's attention the very fact that Jung's engagement with the just mentioned occurred when formulation of his theories was pretty much complete. Hence, Jung was not an objective interpreter of this tradition by any means. The next article which I want to talk about is called Julio Caesar Evola, and it's written by Hans Thomas Haeckel, and it's also in the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. Hans Thomas Haeckel takes a dual approach to examining the figure of Julio Caesar Evola, dedicating the first half of his article to a biography which sketches out the man's anti-liberal, anti-democratic and racist sentiments, and the second half to his diffusionist ideology and a personal philosophy that implicates the attainment of transcendence and final integration into its realms to comprise the final cause of mortal existence. The latter, according to Evola, is attained through magical idealism, a process whereby the absolute I, or what I call the unconscious will, purges an individual of material and intellectual handicaps. Evola's belief in a diamond body is interesting. This he defines as a fusion of unconscious psychic energies that can remain conscious during sleep and even after death. I anticipate that this concept was borrowed from Eastern mysticism, given that the Chinese Taoist text named The Secret of the Golden Flower also describes a diamond body with an identical function. Jung's purely psychological interpretation of the diamond body as the superior personality and of the alchemical opus as a process of individuation explains, I think, Evola's disapproval of Jung. Alternatively, Evola's approval of George Ivanovich Gurdjieff may be hinged on the latter's compliance on fusion of inner consciousness into a diamond body. So Gurdjieff believed in that concept as well. The next book which I would like to talk about, to review, is this little book over here on crack alchemy. It's called The Alchemists Handbook, and it was written by Frater Albertus, or Dr. Albert Richard Riedel. So, it's a very little book, small. In The Alchemist Handbook, Frater Albertus describes in step-by-step and cookbook fashion the lesser work, understood here to mean the extraction of the vital life essence from vegetable matter. This was the procedure which spawned a change of heart in the magician Israel Regardie, who adhered to a purely psycho-spiritual approach to alchemy. The book is intensely focused on practical work, but does give requisite background information regarding theoretical framework for the neophyte in chapters 2 and 6. Chapter 3 details the separation of the soul and the essence. The essence, by essence I mean the combined mercury and sulfur, and the synthesis of the herbal elixir, a procedure which can be carried out using a soxolite extraction apparatus. The manual provides a very helpful chapter entitled Herbs and Stars, identifying plants and herbs with their respective planets, and is presented free of unobtrusive terminology. This book is advertised as offering instructions to produce a modest home laboratory, yet no alternatives are given with respect to Albertus's preferred extraction method using the soxolite extraction apparatus. The latter is a piece of laboratory equipment that isn't inexpensive by any means, as a small search around will often let you know. The next article which I would like to review is called Peristalsis, the Mercurial Mage, and it's published by Fortean Times magazine, which is an online magazine, and it was written by David Hambling. And I'll supply the full, as I said, the full bibliographical details of all these articles and books on the website soon. David Hambling gives a brief exposition on the enigmatic figure of Peristalsis in this article, the man who challenges the Galenic medicine of the time by suggesting a more empirical approach to knowledge, and wrote influential works on medicine, theology, alchemy, and philosophy whilst living the life of a drunken vagabond, who was more often than not decried for his self-righteous disposition and foul mouth. Hamburg correctly points out the developments that allowed for the inception of modern science, and particularly homeopathy, but makes some unusual mistakes. The alchemists interchanged copper with the word Venus, not lead, as David Hambling says. Venus is connected to copper, not lead. Lead is connected to Saturn. And contrary to what he says, many viable and convincing interpretations regarding the substances white eagle and red lion have been put forth. And I think I remember I discussed some of these in relation to Chinese alchemy in an earlier article which I wrote a few months ago. The next book which I would like to review is this one here. It's called A Dictionary of Alchemical Imagery. It's by Lindy Abraham. So it's a dictionary on alchemical symbols, pretty much. So not very thick, but quite condensed entries. It decodes alchemical iconography with places particular stress on the Western intellectual and literary movement. It opens with a broad historiographical introduction outlining the use of symbols as cipher codes for psychological, chemical, and spiritual processes before presenting the symbols in alphabetical listing. Whilst only some of the listings are accompanied by illustrations, all follow a uniform presentation headed by a definition and then followed by a written example and/or a literary quotation from an alchemical treatise. In addition, the author renders a technical, a psychological, philosophical, and a metaphysical interpretation of the term where possible. She also highlights discrepancies and similarities between the interpretation of a particular term by different alchemists and whether or not context is a factor in its interpretation. The fact that alchemy uses many different symbols to represent one idea proved to be a bit of an Achilles heel for Lindy Abraham. She could have tried to expound related entries differently instead of regurgitating the same lines over and over. To give an example, some parts of the explanations relating to the entries lunar, white lily, white rose, pearls, silver swan, white elixir, white foliated earth, and white stone were almost identical. Nevertheless, this will prove indispensable for the study of alchemical symbology to all those who are interested. The next article which I'm wanting to review is called Nicholas Flamel. It's written by Frank Greiner, and it's also in the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. In this brief article, Frank Greiner gives an account of the life of the legendary alchemist Nicholas Flamel. He begins by explaining why this historical figure was tainted with the alchemical paintbrush before going on to identify the 17th century manuscript Livre des Figures Hieroglyphiques as the first appearance we have of Flamel as an adept of the royal art. This is followed by an abbreviated summary of the book's contents. Oddly, Greiner has failed to supply us with details of Flamel's successful transmutations in which he successfully transmuted both mercury and silver into gold. The next article which I would like to review is one on Adam McLean's website on alchemy, and it's called The Birds of Alchemy, which was published on his online Hermetic journal, the fifth installment of his Hermetic journal in 1979, which happens to be the year that I was born. In this fascinating article, Adam McLean not only reveals the inherent link between bird symbolism and the stages of the alchemical opus, but exposes connections that are at once physical and spiritual. After connecting the birds to the life experiences of the soul, he goes on to make the following associations. The black crow is linked to the chemical necrosis or nigredo, and with the turning inward of perception. The white swan to an initial contact with the metaphysical reality outside our corporeal space-time vacuum. The peacock to the alchemical stage known as the peacock's tail, or cauda pavonis, and conscious knowledge of astral body consciousness. The pelican to the strengthening of the spiritual self through the conscious application of these purified and ethereal powers of the soul, and the phoenix to chemical iosis or rubido, and the culmination of spiritual integrations which allow for the existence of etheric being or self without its physical shell. His interpretation is very reminiscent of the diamond body, discussed at length by the Taoist treatise The Secret of the Golden Flower, and the spiritualists Julius Evola and George Gurdjieff. The next article which I'm going to review is also by Adam McLean, and it's also in the fifth installment of the Hermetic Journal, titled Notes on the 12 Keys of Basil Valentine. In this particular article, Adam McLean shows us his deep understanding of the mechanics of alchemical emblem systems, which are usually underpinned by geometric patterns that facilitate coherence and understanding of multi-layered concepts once they have been properly deciphered. This makes much sense from the perspective of the medieval alchemists, who traced the origin of their art back to a country, which is ancient Egypt, whose temple priests saw no problem in overlaying bas-reliefs with a plethora of symbols, irrespective of whether or not the implied meanings were contradictory. All the engravings of the 12 keys, according to McLean, follow a threefold schema that emphasizes the Peristalsian division of matter into philosophical mercury, sulfur, and salt. That's it for that one. The next book which I would like to analyze is Nick Kollerstrom's The Metal-Planet Relationship, a Study of Celestial Influence. It's a really good book. It was published in 1993. It's also a very short one. This text is pretty much pivotal to placing the esoteric doctrine of correspondences back on the scientific map. Chapters 1 to 3 recount a group of experiments conducted by Fra Lely Kalisko, a student of Dr. Rudolf Steiner, in which the former used a chromatographical method to plot the reaction rates of two metal salt precipitates on filter paper during oppositions conjunctions or eclipses of their planetary constituents. Her results showed without a doubt that there is a viable connection between the 7 planets and their respective metals. Colostrum also examines at length the qualitative connection between the aforementioned, their chemical traits and behaviours to alchemical and mythological law. Of particular interest is chapter 14, entitled Alchemists and Gold. The section examines the astrological charts of 7 successful transmutations by the likes of Nicholas Flamel, Edward Kelly, Alexander Seddon, and other famous alchemists. 5 out of the 7 charts were characterized by conjunction between Mercury and the Sun, the 2 planets whose respective metals were involved in transmutation. Perhaps the qualitative link is more important than what has been previously thought. Kalisko's methodology will probably require further modification if it is to satisfy the rigid approach of quantitative analysis, imposed by the contemporary scientific method. Nevertheless, her studies encompass revolutionary implications should any open-minded scientist choose to start where she left off and explore these subtle yet tangible cosmic affinities further. This is obviously followed. This book I followed up by reading this one over here, which is Alison Dave. It's called Metal Power: The Soul Life of the Planets, and it's by Alison Davidson. It's a very, very small book, and it was published in 1991. Unlike Nick Kolestrom's book, which gives a much broader sweep of the esoteric correspondences between the 7 planets and metals, Alison Davidson has chosen to focus exclusively on Frau Lily Kalisko's filter paper experiments as evidence of the hidden qualitative connections in the cosmos that comprise the cosmic forces of the spiritual world, whose re-emergence she clearly anticipates. For Davidson, the esoteric and philosophical speculations are merely the icing on the cake. Most fascinating are Davidson's perspectives on the changing images in the metal salts of silver, tin, gold, and iron, produced during a celestial event involving their respective planets. She also forges connections between the 3 outer planets discovered during and after the Enlightenment, so Uranus with the radioactive element of uranium, Neptune with lithium, and Pluto with plutonium. Of course, let's not forget that this book was written before the latter was demoted from the planetary hierarchy, so Pluto is no longer considered a planet. While no doubt fascinating, these qualitative relationships between the 3 outer planets and their ascribed metals are based solely on metaphysical sentiments. Davidson has neither suggested nor devised an experimental method upon which these personal assertions might be tested and quantified. I inherently feel this line of inquiry to be a dead end for the time being, seeing that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are all too far away to exhibit any sort of gravitational pull or effect on the other 5 planets of our solar system or on the Earth itself. There may or may not be a connection, but even with the most advanced scientific equipment, the energies involved would be so minuscule or little that they would most certainly evade detection. But it's a very fascinating book, that one and the one before it, by Nick Kolostrom. The next article which I would like to talk about is called The History of Alchemy in America, Part 3. It was published in Alchemy Journal in the fourth part of the Alchemy Journal, number 2 in 2003, and it's by Mark Stavish. With his tongue-in-cheek approach, Mark Stavish traces the history of practical alchemy in the United States, beginning with a Californian couple by the name of Richard and Isabella Inglis, who allegedly succeeded in creating the Philosopher's Stone before recounting the widespread activities of Frater Albertus at Salt Lake City, the Rosicrucian Order, Amorc in San Jose, and Alden Research, an offshoot of the latter. In relaying these facts, Stavish's main intention is to reiterate the conviction that practical alchemy is still a living avenue of inquiry in the United States, and though he never says it, may fuel subsequent discoveries in the ever-evolving realm of modern science. The next article, which I'm going to talk about, is called The Secret. Well, it's actually not an article, it's a book. and it's called The Secret History of Hermes Trismegistus, Hermeticism from Ancient to Modern Times. It's written by Florian Ebeling. It's not good. Okay. This book over here, it's originally written, I think, in German. Yeah, translated from the German by David Lorden. So David Lorden is the translator of this good text into English. So in this book, Florian Ebeling isolates and critically examines two distinct streams of Hermeticism that have evolved independently from one another with scant contact, paying particular emphasis to literary Hellenistic, Arabic and Latin texts attributed to the Salvific sage Hermes Trismegistus. Excuse me. The book's main hypothesis is that Alexandrian Hermeticism forked out into two separate streams, with one based on the texts of the Corpus Hermeticum that diffused from Florence in 1471, and the other entirely dependent on the Tabulas Maragdina, or the Emerald Tablet, and the more practical Alchemical texts attributed to the Arabian alchemists. The first proceeded from Italy, the second from Germany north of the Alps. Discounting the fact that their dissimilarities far outweighed their resemblance, they were united in their petition to Hermes Trismegistus. There is a discrepancy regarding the amalgamation of the epithet thrice greatest into the persona of a composite Hermes Thoth. Ebeling suggests that this occurred in the 2nd century, and that's on page 6, though in Koku von Stuckred's Western Esotericism, A Brief History of Secret Knowledge, a much earlier date of the 3rd century BCE is given, and that's on page 18 of that book. I have chosen to adhere to the former, so a later date, on the grounds that a syncretic epithet could not have been philosophized during a time when the Ptolemaic dynasty had just taken control of Egypt, and intellectual exchange between the two cultures was both minimal and superficial. The latter date is also adhered to by Garth Fowden in the Egyptian Hermes, a historical approach to the late pagan mind. The next text which I'm going to talk about is this one here. It's obviously an very old book, The Lure and Romance of Alchemy, written by C.J.S. Thompson. This particular edition was published in 1990, though the book, I'm pretty sure, goes back as far as perhaps 1960, if not earlier, maybe 1970. Yeah, it's a relatively thickish book. Despite its age, The Lure and Romance of Alchemy is a work that gives good historiographical analysis of the field, recounting how it assimilated its philosophical doctrines, its different names under the Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, Hellenistic, Arabian and Christian alchemists, as well as a critical examination of the elixir of life and the philosopher's stone. The book renders the labyrinthine terrain of alchemy easy to understand and works well as an introductory text, especially for those who have no prior exposure to the multifaceted alchemical cosmology. It acquaints them with its multiple aims and secrets, its cipher alphabets, some of its most notable manuscripts, and the laboratory in which both the genuine seeker and charlatan took recourse. Despite the fascination they hold, too much emphasis is placed on the lives and anecdotal legends ascribed to alchemists of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the early modern period. Anyhow, a complete reading of this work reveals the author's perspective. He denies any proof or value in metallic transmutation, but instead relates the important chemical and therapeutic discoveries made by medieval and Renaissance alchemists that played an overarching role in the emergence of chemistry and homeopathic medicine. The latter makes the work a handy reference book, so it's a very good book to have. The next article that I would like to talk about is also in the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. It's called Robert Boyle, and it's written by Lawrence Principe. So basically, this article illuminates the importance of Robert Boyle's position in chemistry as the discoverer of Boyle's law, which at the same time emphasizing his fascination with and belief in the philosopher's stone. With respect to the latter, the author expounds that Boyle had acquired a mysterious red powder called red earth, known to the alchemists as philosophical mercury, which consumed him for the remainder of his life. Principi gives like an overall favourable analysis of Boyle and neglects to mention the man's hypocritical disposition. Together with Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle publicly decried the writing in The Skeptical Chemist that their writings, as their furnaces, afford as well smoke as light. The next article which I would like to talk about is written by Bert Hamberg, and it's called On the Colour Changes in the Great Work or the Alchemical Transformation of Matter, and that's published in the Hermetic Journal as well, and can be found on Adam McLean's website. In this article, Bert Hamberg argues that the Truan colour systems, so black, white and red, delineating the alchemical opus and the generation of the Philosopher's Stone, was developed by the medieval Christian alchemists in their attempts to give metallic transmutation credibility. The colours, according to Hamberg, were picked according to their symbolism and psychological effects. I find his suppositions erroneous. The colour scheme has existed in alchemical cosmology from its pre-Christian birth in Greco-Roman Alexandria, and the individual colours are not merely descriptors for emotions or feelings qualitatively linked to them, or exoteric stand-ins for the transformation of consciousness. The next article which I'm going to talk about is also by Mark Stavish. It's called Alchemy. It's not just for the Middle Ages anymore. It was published in the well-known magazine, well-known New Age, we can call it, magazine called Atlantis Rising, in 1997. Mark Stavish's article does a great job of illuminating the animistic cosmogony upon which alchemical principles are based and separating them from the commonly held misconception of the esoteric science as little more than an anachronistic and medieval superstition, though all too often he ends up jumping around from one esoteric discipline to another. Moreover, he erroneously alludes to the evolution of alchemy from ancient Kabbalah. Stavish also gives a brief explanation of Jung's reductionist approach to alchemy as a psychological discipline, and goes on to mention how it ties in with alternative medicine, quantum physics, and the New Age movement. He concludes by offering a few leads on how to gain practical instruction in both spagyric-based and metallic-based alchemy. So in all, it's a pretty good article. The next book which I'm going to talk about is called The Egyptian Hermes, A Historical Approach to the Late Pagan Mind. It was written by Garth Fowden, and the publication, or the book that I read, was a 1993 reprint or edition. You can find it if you look for it on Amazon.com. This book I don't have to show because I borrowed it. So the Egyptian Hermes pretty much traces the modes of Egyptian and Hellenistic thought that poured into the cross-cultural melting pot of Ptolemaic Alexandria to form the philosophical theological framework called Hermeticism, which functioned as a cultural umbrella for the scholastic writings of so many philosophers in late antiquity. Fowden treats his subject matter sympathetically, attempting to understand both contextual spirituality and the multifarious mindset of late antiquity. The book is divided into three main sections, all of which proceed in a logical fashion. The first, called Modes of Cultural Transmission, discusses qualities of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, as well as text attributes, legends, myths, and sites ascribed to each one. Fowden implicates the Hellenized Egyptian priest Manetho to have been pivotal in acquiring the Greek to the Egyptian acquainting the Greeks to the Egyptian religion and traditions. The second, titled The Way of Hermes, discusses the occult worldview of sympathia that seems to have derived from the Stoics and found its way to the proliferating cultural milieu of philosophical and technical Hermetica. In the third, named The Milieu of Hermeticism, Fowden critically examines the socio-political climate in Greco-Roman Egypt and comes to the conclusion that despite their widespread appeal, the Hermetic scriptures were exclusively, piously and scrupulously studied by small groups, usually the literati, under the guidance of a teacher. This book suggests that despite their philological affiliation with the Hellenistic and Neoplatonic styles, the texts did in fact preserve elements of the then waning Egyptian wisdom, literature, and tradition. So it's a pretty good read. The next article, which I'm going to talk about, is also in the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. It's called Tarot, and it's written by Juan Pierre Laurent. So this article on Tarot is a noteworthy footnote to the card game tradition. His scholastic approach of compartmentalizing its historiographical evolution without succumbing to a full-fledged engagement of its manifold esoteric interpretation is commendable. Through this article, the reader learns that the prototype of what can be called tarot emerged in the late 15th century, so in about 1460 in Germany and Italy, before undergoing substantial evolution under the helm of occultist Eliphas Levi, who were added a metaphysical tier of meaning to the tarot by linking symbolic correspondences described by the 22 major arcana and 56 minor arcana, with the occult idea of final causes for each mortal life as mapped out by the astrological configuration. The symbolic nature of the tarot has generated a host of multifarious interpretations, the most popular being Aleister Crowley's holistic approach in which he incorporated into his magical speculations. The article is a great starting point for further investigation. The next article that I'm going to talk about is written by Adam McLean, and it's called A Commentary on the Rosarium Philosophorum, and it's published on the online journal The Rosary of the Philosophers in 1980, and it's on his website. In this article, Adam McLean reveals that the cluster of alchemical images entitled the Rosarium Philosophorum expresses the transmutation of the soul within the twofold context that includes mystical development as well as basic chemical operations. Whilst the vitalistic and intrinsic processes of change delineated by alchemy cannot ever be confined to the intellectual framework of a pictorial and symbolic formula, McLean basically agrees with Carl Jung's interpretation of the Rosarium. In a nutshell, the sequence is comprised of 20 illustrations. The first 3 are concerned with the psychic composition of the prima materia, the prime substance, the next 7 with the synthesis of the white stone, or what many understand to mean the spiritualization of human consciousness under the meditation of the archetypal feminine, and the 7 after that with the creation of the red stone, or an illumination and embodiment of the spirit after it has fixated or coagulated its final form. The last 3 images that complete the series reveal the complete integration of psychic elements in one spiritual wellspring. McLean could have been probably more selective with his terminology for the anatomy of the psyche. Many parts were rather confusing. The next book that I'm going to talk about is by Arthur Lewis, and it's called The Philosophy of Magic. It was published, the edition that I read was published in 1988 by Penguin Books, and it can be found also on Amazon.com. I don't have a copy to show because I also borrowed that book from the library. The Philosophy of Magic can be described as an ode to mysticism in which alchemical transmutation of consciousness, alchemical transmutation and magical incantation are exoteric markers and symbols that delineate transformation of consciousness, or the self. The book encompasses 2 main sections, one on a practical and spiritual magic based on esoteric correspondences, and one on alchemy, the latter enumerating steps to transcendence and union with the divine. Lewis connects the 2 areas of inquiry by suggesting that their common aim was the eviction of demonic forces, understood here to mean carnal drives, habits and emotional effluxes from the total personality, and the reinvigoration of angelic intelligences in the individual mind. In Lewis's mind, practical application of these 2 esoteric denominations for purposes other than spiritual attainment, i.e., for example, to cast a spell or create tulpas or disembodied forces, is nothing more than a gross perversion of the Hermetic art, which also happens to be the perspective of Zosimus of Panopolis, as we saw before. His interpretation is heavily underpinned by Eastern mysticism and brings to mind, as I was saying, the intellectual and philosophical approach of both Zosimus of Panopolis and Olympiodorus, who came afterwards in about 500 CE. And both of these decreed that the intangible realm of spirit involved purification of the soul. This condensed little book is a good reference tool for those interested in the mystical interpretation of esotericism's magical and alchemical currents. The next text which I would like to examine is called A Short Examination of the Book of Hieroglyphical Figures of Nicholas Flamel. It was published in the Hermetic Journal in 2011. It's by David Lindholm, and it can also be found on David McLean's website. So in this exposition, David Lindholm shows how the physical description of the Book of Hieroglyphic Images is anachronistic and incompatible with the era to which it is ascribed, and it's ascribed to the Middle Ages. Based on a systematic examination of anatomical features such as size, material, writing, illustrations, and cover, Lindholm concludes that the composition must have been drawn from Coptic or Ethiopian sources and be no older than about 4 centuries. Lindholm's argument is sound and historically accurate. And that will do, I think, for today. That's something like about 30 articles, books, and online sources. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you some perspective on which books and articles to pursue for your studies. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye.